Hello and welcome to Understanding Plato. My name is Eric Orwell. Today we'll be looking at the Handbook of Platonism by Alcinous, who was a Middle Platonic philosopher of the 2nd century AD. This work was probably not intended as an introductory text on Plato for students, but rather for teachers of Platonism. So this gives us some nice insight into how Platonism was taught during that era of Middle Platonism, which is often not well understood. Plutarch is the most famous Middle Platonist, and he did go beyond his biographies to talk about cosmology, metaphysics, elements of Platonism itself in his Moralia. We'll probably be covering that in the not too distant future. So, in the first chapter, Alcinous defines philosophy as freeing the soul from the body, turning towards what truly is. So this goes in line with the Pythagorean concept of philosophy. Some attribute the term philosophy to Pythagoras in the first place, so we are sticking with that Pythagorean spirit of philosophy, not as an abstract system, intellectual system, but involves a conversion of the soul towards the true beings and away from the world of illusion, you might say. Philosophers need a natural capacity for branches of learning that lead towards knowledge of intelligible beings. And those are identified in the Republic as math, logic, dialectics, because math is supposed to occupy a middle realm between the intelligibles and the realm of sense. The soul is actually on the same level as the realm of mathematics. In the Timaeus, the demiurge composes the world soul out of mathematical ratios. So there's something in common between the essence of the soul and the essence of mathematics. That and logic and dialectics helps the soul to learn how to focus on fixed realities rather than being oriented towards the world of generation and sensation. Philosophers also need to be enamored of truth and hate falsehood. They need to have a naturally temperate nature and be restrained with their passions. They have to have liberality of mind, open-mindedness, a natural affinity for justice, and a good memory, very significantly, and a ready capacity to learn. We are often at a deficit in trying to learn the thought of the ancients because they had much better memories than us in general. They memorized epic poetry. We don't memorize nearly as much as ancient peoples were used to doing. But a particularly good memory is important for the philosopher because you have to be able to remember the long chains of arguments that you're dealing with. You have to be able to keep these fixed forms in your mind over time. These qualities can perfect the individual when they're nurtured, or they can be a cause of evil if neglected. That doesn't obviously apply to being enamored of the truth or being naturally temperate, but the idea is that the best, when corrupted, becomes the worst. And so if you have all of these innate advantages, you're going to do well regardless of what kind of field you go into. And if you don't cultivate these natural abilities, they will become corrupted and give you power to do great evil. In the second chapter, Alcinous talks about the two types of life. There's essentially the theoretical life and the practical life. The theoretical is the activity of intellect when apprehending intelligibles. So the turning of the soul, the conversion of the soul towards those permanent true beings. Contemplation of them is one kind of life, and it is the higher life. And then the practical life is the activity of a rational soul, logos, using the body. Theoretical life is consummated in knowledge of truth. That is the end of the theoretical life. Practical life is consummated in the performance of what is counseled by reason. So the highest ideal of the practical life is bringing it in conformity with reason. The soul that contemplates the divine has wisdom, which is a likeness to the divine. So this is a definition of wisdom given to us by Alcinous. Contemplation of the divine is wisdom. And when you have that image of the divine in your soul, you become like to the divine. The practical life is contingent. The theoretical life, the contemplative life, has the source of its good inherent in it. It's inalienable. The practical life is a necessity and isn't pursued for its own sake. It should transfer the visions of the contemplative life to human affairs. So in the Republic, the guardians are meant to leave the cave, leave the realm of sensibles, and find that archetype of the state in the intelligible realm, to know it intuitively by direct contact, and then to descend back down and structure human affairs in accordance with that divine vision attained through their focus on the contemplative life. In the third chapter, Alcinous outlines the major topics that philosophers deal with. We have theoretical philosophy, practical philosophy, and dialectical philosophy. Theoretical philosophy deals with what really exists. So we are looking at theology, the science of motionless and primary causes, which is basically the same as metaphysics. Physics, dealing with the motion of the heavenly bodies especially, and mathematics, which is its own class of real essential beings. For practical philosophy, the object is the performance of what is noble, and the subdivision goes down to ethics of the individual, economics of the household, and the politics of the state. Dialectical philosophy, the study of the nature of reasoning, deals with principles of division, definition, analysis, induction or synthesis, and the syllogistic or principles of inference. Division, right, identifying discrete categories, which is related to analysis, and then definition, setting the bounds on a particular category by inclusion criteria. Induction, or the principle of synthesis, combining species into a general category. And then there's the syllogism, which is either demonstrative, epichyromatic, enthymetic, or sophistic. The demonstrative syllogism is apodeictically certain. It is universally true. The epichyromatic syllogism deals with a premise that is supported by popular opinion or a likely empirical principle. The enthymeme is an incomplete syllogism with one of the premises left out or the conclusion left out. And then sophistic inferential principles have to be identified as well. And Plato uses some sophistic tools when he's trying to convince others in the dialogues, I would argue. So these are the main topics that philosophy deals with, and we will dig into them more specifically. In the fourth chapter, Alcinous goes into the different faculties of judgment, and the Greek term there is kriterion. He distinguishes between the judger, that which is judged, and the judgment as the process. Ultimately, the agency which judges is intellect, but it uses, which is nous, but it uses the means of reasoning or logos. So in one sense, it is reason that judges. In another sense, it's the philosopher, the agent of judgment, that does the judging. There is an unerring divine reason and a human reason which only grasps truth dependent on its cognition of reality. So the divine logos is self-substantial. It doesn't depend for its truth on the particular objects which are judged. Human reason depends on the objects that we're looking at for its validity, in the same way that a syllogism is only as true as its premises. So human reason is directed at both intelligibles and sensibles. The reason which deals with intelligibles is scientific, and its conclusions are known with certainty. Right? If human reason is dependent on its object, then when it's aimed at objects which are eternal, then its conclusions are universally true. When it's dealing with sensation, its conclusions are based on opinion and can only ever be given a kind of probabilistic truth. In the dialogues, this notion of probability comes up often, and sensible things can be judged with probability. Intelligible things can be judged with certainty. Sensation takes place through the faculty of eikasia and is an affection of the soul caused by its association with body. So when the soul is outside of the body, there is no sensation. When a sensation is preserved, this creates a memory. And opinion is the combination of sensation and memory. The soul uses thought to review and compare opinions. Thought is the dialogue of the soul with itself. Intellection is the activity of intellect, nous, as it contemplates intelligibles, which is kind of a tautological definition, but that's what we get. There is incorporeal intellection, which is actually intellection in the strict sense. And then there's corporeal intellection, what we have after we've entered into bodies, which is a kind of building up of natural conceptions, innate ideas. It's sort of similar to the way that memory works. Memory is a lasting impression of some object of sense awareness. The innate ideas, the basic conceptions of our human intellect in a body, are remembered from the life before body. This is the basis of the doctrine of anamnesis, or recollection. Incorporeal intellection is the first principle of reasoning. When we describe the process of reasoning, we recognize that reasoning begins from first principles. But in a body, in the human process of reasoning, we begin from those innate ideas that are already themselves kind of memories of the true intellection, which is prior to our life here, and that kind of eternally is the principle of reasoning. There are primary and secondary intelligibles. The primary intelligibles are judged by intellection with the help of scientific reasoning, and secondary intelligibles are judged primarily by scientific reasoning with the help of intellection. The primary intelligibles are those intelligible forms above the mundane realm. Secondary intelligibles are the intelligible aspects of the sensible world. This is why we can measure out mathematical proportions even of sensible objects. They have intelligible characteristics, their intelligible form as they appear in the world. And to make judgments about intelligible form, primarily we deal with scientific reasoning, so a process of comparing these intelligible structures that are given to us intuitively, and that is aided by intellection itself, which provides the basic units out of which any scientific process of reasoning must grow. And we deal with the primary intelligibles beyond the mundane realm, primarily with this intuitive faculty of intellection, but we are aided by scientific reasoning, likely by analogy. There are also primary and secondary sensibles. The primary sensibles are the identities of the qualia as such. So a particular color is a primary sensible. It doesn't exist in any one particular instantiation. The secondary sensibles are the particular qualitative aspects of particular sensible objects. And both primary and secondary sensibles are judged through sensation with the help of opinionative reasoning. Reasoning compares things, and so we primarily use this intuitive faculty of sensation, the given data, and then we compare it using opinionative reasoning. Whereas the compound of the primary and the secondary sensibles is judged first through opinionative reasoning, but is aided by sensation. The compound of primary and secondary involves judgments about the relationship of the universal qualia and particular qualia. And so to evaluate that compound, we first have to use this comparing faculty of reasoning. But of course, it is the reasoning that is aimed down at sensibles, and so is opinionative rather than scientific. Alcinous then goes on to describe dialectics, which is one of the three things that Socrates claims to know in the dialogues. And dialectics, for Alcinous, is meant to identify first the essences of things and then their accidental qualities. And you examine the essences of things from above through division and definition, those logical procedures, and from below by means of analysis. We'll get a deeper description of these concepts in just a moment. Accidental qualities are examined through individuals by induction or through universal properties through syllogism. Dialectic then uses division, definition, analysis, induction, and syllogistic. A similar list is given by other commentators, and you will sometimes see synthesis instead of induction and demonstration instead of syllogistic. Division divides a genus into species or a whole into parts. You also divide the different senses of a single term or different accidental qualities that can apply to the same species. So a man can be accidentally a tall man or a short man. Those accidental properties are identified through division. Definition arises from division. Beginning with the genus, you divide it according to the most proximate differentia. The genus plus those differentia creates the definition. For example, you would have the definition of man sometimes given as a rational animal. So you take the genus animal and then apply these differentiating features that some species have, others don't. So you could go rational, irrational, flying versus terrestrial versus aquatic. These sorts of categorical divisions are the differentia. So the genus plus a set of differentia constitutes a definition. And there are three types of analysis that he identifies. There is the ascent from sense objects to intelligibles. This is given the name analysis. And the classic example is from the Phaedrus, where you have the motion from appreciation of particular bodily beauty to beauty in general, beauty in souls, beauty in activities, beauty in laws, and then on to this kind of intelligible beauty in itself. So that process is a kind of analysis. The second is an ascent from the demonstrable to the indemonstrable. So you begin from a postulate, and then you consider what propositions are antecedent to it. You move from the posterior to the prior among those antecedent propositions. You find the most primary and universally admitted principle at the end of that list of prior propositions, and then move back from this to the original postulate by synthesis. So he gives an example. If the soul is immortal, that's our original postulate. That's the thing we're trying to analyze by bringing it back to some indemonstrable first principle. So if the soul is immortal, it is ever moving. The ever moving is self-moving, and there would be arguments at each of these steps supporting these claims. The self-moving is a first principle of motion. First principles are ungenerated. The ungenerated is imperishable, and this is the kind of most basic, most prior principle involved in this list of antecedent propositions. And what he means by antecedent propositions is just that a given claim entails other more general categories of being very often. The soul, for example, involves the idea of motion. And so that proposition considering motion will be a prior proposition to something about the soul. So the ungenerated is imperishable is that first most basic premise that most people would agree with. And then from there, you move back. So a first principle is something ungenerated and imperishable. The first principle of motion is the self-moved, but the self-moved is the soul. Therefore, the soul is imperishable, ungenerated, and immortal. The third type of analysis looks very much like the second type to me. It is an ascent from hypotheses to unhypothetical first principles. You begin with a hypothesis, then find another hypothesis which entails the former hypothesis, Then you find a third hypothesis, which entails that second hypothesis, and you do this until you arrive at a principle which is non-hypothetical. Now, induction is any logical procedure which passes from like to like, or which moves from the particular to the general. He says it's useful for activating the natural concepts, the kind of physical innate ideas in us, and it generally moves from empirical things to the general, but he says it's any logical procedure which passes from like to like as well, which is a bit broader than the average definition of induction, but this is what he gives here. And he'll move on from here to discuss that last aspect of dialectics, the syllogistic. So syllogisms are made up of propositions. Propositions are claims, individual affirmative or negative claims. So propositions can be affirmative, negative, they can also be universal or particular, right? All cats are white is a universal proposition, which is false. Obviously, this cat is white is a particular proposition. So you can have universal affirmation. An example, all that is base is evil. Universal negation, none of the things that are base is good. A particular affirmation, some pleasure is good. Particular negation, some pleasure is not good. Some propositions are categorical, others are hypothetical. Categorical propositions are simple. Hypotheticals, as he puts it, exhibit consequentiality or incompatibility, which I take to mean simply that they are contingent. They're conditional statements. Categorical propositions are direct. Hypotheticals are conditional. He defines a syllogism as a form of words in which, when certain assumptions are made, something other than that which has been assumed necessarily follows from those very assumptions. And syllogisms can be demonstrative or refutational. They can prove something or prove that something is not the case. We have categorical syllogisms, hypothetical syllogisms, and mixed syllogisms. Categorical syllogisms have both the premises and the conclusions as simple propositions, so categorical propositions as defined above. Hypothetical syllogisms have all of their premises being hypothetical. A mixed syllogism uses both categorical and hypothetical propositions in its premises. Alcinous says that Plato uses demonstrative syllogisms when expositing doctrine. He uses syllogisms based on widely held opinion when dealing with sophists and the youth, and then he uses euristics when dealing with eristic argumentative interlocutors like Euthydemus or Hippias. So there are three figures of syllogisms determined by the way in which the common term factors into the individual premises. You're going to have one and the same term appear in the two premises in order to form a complete syllogism. And so the first type, the first figure syllogism, has the common term as a predicate in one premise and as the subject in the other. Johnny is short, Johnny is the subject, short is the predicate. So all just things are fine, fine being the predicate, all fine things are good, fine things there being the subject, and therefore all just things are good. So that's a first figure syllogism. Second figure has the common term as a predicate in both premises. So for example, and these are all Platonic examples that he gives, what does not have parts is neither straight nor curved. So that's a predicate. What partakes in shape is either straight or curved, which is a predicate. And then therefore, what does not have parts does not partake in shape. The third figure syllogism has the common term as a subject in both premises. So that which partakes in shape is qualified, that which partakes in shape is limited, therefore something that is qualified is limited. He concludes that technical description of syllogisms by stating that if you know the faculties of the soul and the differences between men and which types of discourse are fitted to which types of soul, And if you know the opportune moment for using a particular argument, then your rhetorical skill may justly be called scientific. And he takes that from Plato. Towards the end of the Phaedrus, Socrates discusses with Phaedrus what constitutes scientific rhetoric, and this is basically the definition we get from Plato. He also claims, Alcinous does, that Plato indicates Aristotle's 10 categories in the Parmenides. And he also investigates etymology in the Cratylus. So in the Cratylus, Plato explores whether names come from nature or convention. He says they come from both. The correctness of a name is a convention which is in accord with the nature of a given thing, and dialectics is responsible for using names correctly. So kind of just taking us back there to the genre that we were originally dealing with. And now we've looked at all 5 of those logical procedures from dialectics, and we'll next move on to mathematics. Math is listed as one of 3 theoretical sciences: theology, physics, and mathematics. Theology is defined as the knowledge of primary causes, which fits closer to most definitions of metaphysics. So the principal causes in reality is the domain of theology. Physics covers the nature of the universe, what sort of animal man is, where his place in the world, if God exercises providence, if other gods are ranked beneath him. So we already have this idea of the one God, calling basically the Platonic one God, and then the other gods, asking if they are ranked beneath him as part of physics, and then the relation of men to gods. So a lot of these aspects really fit into what people today might call theology. And then mathematics has to do with the nature of the plane and three-dimensional being and the phenomena of change and locomotion, which seems like a fairly limited definition. Math sharpens the intellect, prepares the soul for the ascent to being, but math itself, however, has only a dreamlike apprehension of reality because it doesn't reason from principles that are revealed directly. Its principles remain hypothetical, and so it's not as close to the truth as dialectic, which does allow us to move all the way up. But mathematics prepares our soul for that ascent. Arithmetic delivers us from errors of sensation. Plato mentions examples like this, where due to an optical illusion, we can't perceive the accurate ratio of 2 things. And so then we use the art of measurement and arithmetic to sort out those sorts of errors of sensation. It's also useful for the practice of war. Geometry, he says, is useful for the knowledge of the good. He doesn't really elaborate this too much. Astronomy teaches us the motions of the heavens and indirectly about their creator. And then music moves us from audible harmony to intelligible harmony. So none of these so-called sciences are for their own sake. These 4 branches of mathematics should be used to ascend past dianoetic knowledge into the realm of intelligibles. So Plato doesn't call math true science, which belongs to intelligible subject matters, and he doesn't call it mere opinion, which deals with sensibles. It is dianoetic knowledge, its own epistemological status. Dialectic, on the other hand, is scientific since it brings us all the way to the intelligibles. Dialectics, philosophy, broadly speaking, is the kind of mother science of the mathematical disciplines. And matter is the lowest rung on the ladder of being for Plato. According to Alcinous, Plato calls matter a mold, all-receiver, nurse, mother, and space. That last point is very interesting. There are theories in modern physics that build matter out of space, so this may be literally true. The imagery of the nurse and mother has to do with the quality of matter as being all-receiving, so it fosters the development of form by taking it into itself. The mold term is not the structuring principle that is used to mold something, but that which is molded. It is a substratum tangible by non-sensation. So you can't even feel matter, strictly speaking, in any knowledgeable way. It's below even opinion, and it's graspable by a bastard reasoning. So it's only a very vague notion we can have of matter. It receives all form and the whole realm of generation, which it sustains as a nurse without having form or quality itself. So matter is not being portrayed here as totally base and lowly. Plotinus sometimes seems to portray matter in a negative light. It is the lowest rung on the ladder, but it still has positive qualities. The perfumer, as an example of this all-receiving characteristic of matter, the perfumer wants to use a base oil that is as odorless as possible. And the clay sculptor first smooths the clay so as to be as devoid of shape as possible. Both of these occupations are trying to create that perfect, qualityless matter out of which to then create their products. Matter is not a body since it has no shape. So body is matter with form. And matter is not incorporeal, but it is potentially a body. That's the mode of subsistence that matter has. Alcinous then moves on to discuss the forms. The forms are paradigmatic principles constituted by God, the Father and cause of all things. So this is the language regarding the metaphysical absolute of this Middle Platonist. I think that's noteworthy. Form is for God, his thinking. For us, the ultimate objects of our thought. For matter, measure. For the sensible world, its paradigm. And for itself, essence. Everything that we can conceptualize must come to be in reference to something of which the paradigm must pre-exist. So conceptualization, intelligibility is contingent on some stable target. So the paradigm must pre-exist particular things in order for them to be intelligible. Form is, we have a definition, an eternal model of things that are in accordance with nature. So most Platonists reject forms of artificial objects and also of deviations from natural processes like sickness. They also reject forms of individuals ordinarily, although some say that individuals participate of the form of their soul. So the soul has something akin to the nature of forms. Many Platonists reject forms of trivial things such as dirt or hair and things like that. The examples from the Parmenides. They also sometimes reject forms of relations, such as the greater or superior, because the forms are supposed to be eternal, fixed objects of thought for God. And the forms are justified by the concept of God, since if he is an intellect or has intellect, he has thoughts. These thoughts are eternal, and they are the forms. Another argument, if matter is unmeasured in its own right, it needs to receive measures from something else superior to it and immaterial. So if this is the nature of matter, that it is an ultimate receiver, it needs to receive its nature from something immaterial. But the former, matter is unmeasured, so the latter. It receives its structuring principles from above, ergo the forms exist as a type of immaterial measure. And lastly, we have an argument from our own faculties cognitively. So intellect differs from true opinion, therefore the objects of intellect differ from the objects of true opinion. True opinion has to do with physical things. The objects of intellect are the forms. Alcinous moves on to discuss the concept of the primal God. He talks about this entity in monotheistic terms, although he does mention the gods in this section. This is one of three principles he talks about. We already covered form and matter in the previous two sections, and now this primal God is the first principle. This to me looks like the One as that primal God the monad as the principle of form, and then the indefinite dyad as the principle of matter. So perhaps this is why these are identified as the three first principles in Platonism by Alcinous. So looking at this highest of all principles, he starts by clarifying the relationship of the gods to intellection. Intellect is particularly related to his concept of this primal god. Probably that is due to the influence of Aristotle. The Aristotelian definition of God will appear below, more or less. So to start with, there are primary objects of intellection, just as there are primary objects of sense perception. Human individuals have difficulty thinking of objects of intellection without bringing in sensible images to the imagination. The gods, on the other hand, being free from sense perception, apprehend intelligibles in a pure way. So this is just to get us to recognize by abstraction from the way that we think and by analogy to the way that we think, the mode of cognition, if you can call it that, that would belong to the gods. The primal god, however, is not engaged with intelligibles as a separate entity. He is the cause of the intelligibles. The primal god would be the cause of all intellect, remaining unmoved in the same way that an object of desire moves the desirer while remaining unmoved. So this is a nice poetic description of God as an unmoved mover. Although he also says that God doesn't move anything directly himself, as in there is no separate activity of God. This is definitely in line with absolute divine simplicity, what he'll say below. So here's this Aristotelian definition, more or less. God must be everlastingly engaged in thinking of itself and its own thoughts, and this activity of it is form. So the way he articulates this is closer to Aristotle's definition. The later Neoplatonists will try to create more distance between the one as this absolute principle of all things and the prime intellects. These blend together a little bit in Alcinous, although divine simplicity also comes up, as we'll see. The primary God is eternal, ineffable, self-perfect, ever-perfect, all-perfect, divinity, essentiality, rather than an essence. He doesn't possess an essence. He is essentiality. He is truth, commensurability, beauty, good, and Father. And these terms are not distinct in God. So this is where you get this divine simplicity doctrine, where God doesn't have separate attributes. He doesn't have properties that are distinct from himself. Any of his properties is at the same time the whole of himself. He is neither genus, nor species, nor differentia. He has no attributes distinct from himself. He is neither qualified nor unqualified. He is not a part of anything, and he is not a whole composed of parts. He is not the same as anything, nor different from anything. If any of these relations held between God and other things, then God would be subject to those determinations, and he's always superior to them. You know, if God participated of sameness, for instance, then sameness would have to be above him. If God participated in goodness as a distinct property, then goodness would be superior to him. But ex hypothesi, he is the first principle of all things, and so he can't have any of these kinds of attributes, relational attributes like that. There are three modes of conception of God for Alcinous. One by abstraction, just as we form the conception of a point by abstraction from sensible phenomena, conceiving first a surface, then a line, and finally a point. Right? The second, by analogy, the sun is to vision and to visible objects as the primal intellect is to the power of intellection in the soul and to its objects. For it is not the power of intellection itself, but provides intellection to it, and intelligibility to its objects, illuminating the truth contained in them. This analogy, of course, is from the Republic. And dialectic, he doesn't give this name for the third way, he just describes the example from the Phaedrus here. But I think this is consistent with other definitions of dialectic that I've seen, so I chose to call it that. One contemplates first beauty in bodies, then after that turns to the beauty in soul, then to that in customs and laws, and then to the great sea of beauty, after which one gains an intuition of the good itself and the final object of love and striving, like a light appearing and, as it were, shining out to the soul, which ascends in this way, and along with this, one also intuits God, in virtue of his preeminence in honor. And I think the text might be out of order a little bit, because he also ends by saying, God is partless, since wholes are posterior to their parts. If a whole is made up of parts, the parts have to kind of exist in order for the whole to exist. But God is posterior to nothing. So it's consistent with absolute divine simplicity as early as the 2nd century AD, which is certainly notable. But there's also a kind of blending together of the Aristotelian notion of God and the Platonic notion of God. I think I probably side more with the later Neoplatonists and wouldn't describe the one as engaged in thinking. But of course, according to the rest of his attributes and definitions of God here, God's thinking could not be distinct from himself. So the extent to which he can apply the Aristotelian definition is limited, and it must be analogical. But anyway, that's his thoughts on God. Alcinous rounds out his discussion of theology before moving on to physics by discussing the incorporeality of qualities. He gives a couple syllogisms on this. The first is, every body is a subject. Quality is not a subject, but an attribute. Therefore, quality is not a body. He also gives, qualities are in subjects, but no body is in a subject. Therefore, quality is not a body. He also gives, qualities are contrary to one another, but bodies are not contrary to one another. So qualities are not bodies. On that last one, bodies don't differ from one another qua bodies, but in their qualities. Matter is devoid of quality, and quality in its essence is devoid of matter, and therefore is incorporeal. If qualities are incorporeal, that which creates them must also be incorporeal. A nice sequence of arguments here, very interesting. So qualities here reflect the function of form. So we have a quality-matter distinction here that mirrors basically the form-matter distinction. When a body has a quality, it has it through participation in the form that is the cause of that quality. Alcinous gives a brief account of the generation of the world inspired by the Timaeus. I don't know exactly how true to the Timaeus this is. There are a couple details that I spotted that seem divergent, but in any case, it reads very mythically. So, just as individual objects are always patterned on their models, a man on the form of man, so the world was made by God in the image of the form of world. He created the world out of the totality of matter, which moved without order and randomly prior to the generation of the heavens. So out of a preceding chaos that was kind of essentially material, he introduces suitable numbers and shapes to create distinct elements. He exhausts the whole capacity of each of the elements in creation: fire, air, water, and earth. First, he created fire and earth because he knew he was creating a corporeal world, and you need fire and earth to produce visibility and tangibility of corporeal things. And then to bond these together, he introduced air and water in a similar proportion to that between fire and earth. He needed two elements to function as a bond because the world is not a plane figure, but a sphere. Now, fire is to air, as air is to water, and as water is to earth. So there's a similar proportion in the elements. He made the world both unique of its kind and likened numerically to its form, which was itself one. And this is a traditional Platonic doctrine that there is one world. However, that doesn't necessarily exclude multiverse arguments that we hear in the modern day if we simply say that those branching timelines or disconnected bubble universes are really just part of this one much larger world. You could take that step, and a good Platonic analogy to support such a line would be the analogy at the end of, I think, the Phaedo, where he talks about how we think that we are on the surface of the earth, but actually we're in one great cave among many great caves. The earth is much, much larger than we think, and there are different realms on the earth with different subtle matter or denser matter. So I think this could be interpreted as metaphorical about the existence of other realms that are accessible within this one great world. And he made the world spherical and with a circular motion, because the circular motion is the most perfect and the sphere is the most perfect shape. Alcinous goes on to describe more specifically the formation of the elements. So when the elements were mentioned above, these were kind of elements in potency. They were the potential of these elemental distinctions, but they hadn't been given their definite form. The world is made out of body and soul, the visible and tangible, and the invisible and intangible. The body aspect is composed of fire, earth, water, and air. But these aren't actual elements just yet. The creator has to give them shapes, so he gives the shape of the pyramid, as Alcinous calls it, or the tetrahedron, more specifically, to fire, the cube to earth, the octahedron to air, and the icosahedron to water. The behavior of these four elements does map onto what we would intuit given these shapes. The tetrahedron has the fewest sides. It is the least dense of the elements. Fire rises through air and seemingly has an ability to penetrate basically anything. The cube fits earth, being stable, stationary. The octahedron for air is not as fine as fire, but certainly less dense and more penetrating than the other elements. And then the icosahedron, a roundish, 20-sided, 20-sided shape would kind of flow together in the way that water does. And encompassing these, the dodecahedron, the 12-sided Platonic solid with pentagonal faces, which he used for the universe as a whole. How exactly that squares with the idea that the universe is shaped like a sphere, I have no idea. Underlying these solid shapes are the two ancestral elements of plane figures. Planes are obviously prior to solids, and the first principles of planes will be these two right triangles. The right angle is the measure of all other angles, according to Proclus in his commentaries on Euclid's Elements. So there is a privileging of right angles overall, perhaps a justified one. So we have the two basic types of right angle triangle, the right scalene, and specifically the right scalene, which has a 30-degree angle, a 60-degree angle, and a 90-degree angle. That's the triangle that's going to be used the most in constructing these elements. And then the right isosceles, which is really just used for earth. So the tetrahedron is made of 4 equilateral triangles, looking basically like a pyramid with a triangular base. Each of these is made of 6 30, 60, 90 right scalene triangles. So an equilateral triangle will be made up of 6 of these kinds of basic triangles. You'd think a case could be made that the equilateral triangle itself is one of these basic shapes, but we have it here as a composite from the 30, 60, 90 right scalene. The octahedron is made of 8 equilateral triangles, each of which is composed of 6 scalene. So we have a total of 48 triangles in the octahedron. The icosahedron is made of 20 equilateral triangles, which will amount to 120 30, 60, 90 right scalenes. The square is made of 4 isosceles triangles. And from 6 squares, we get the cube. So 4 times 6 gives us 24 isosceles triangles to the cube. And now regarding the dodecahedron, there are 12 signs of the zodiac, taking up 30 degrees each. Now, the dodecahedron has 12 pentagonal faces made up of 5 triangles each of these triangles is made of 6 smaller triangles. So there are 30 triangles to each face, 12 faces, just like there are 30 degrees to each of the zodiacal signs. There are then 360 triangles in the dodecahedron, just as there are 360 degrees in the zodiac. What I'm gleaning from this maybe is that the dodecahedron is a formal principle for the universe. It's a symbol of the universe, but isn't quite the shape in a literal sense. Just like not every form that we participate of is participated in the manner of shape. Something like that might be going on. The spatial analogy doesn't quite hold with the zodiac because, of course, looking on a single band around the equator, we see the 12 signs of the zodiac, whereas the 12 pentagonal faces of the dodecahedron face in every direction, not in this single band where we have the zodiac in astronomy. And last, the elements do not remain separate, but unceasingly agitate one another due to the revolution of the sphere as a whole. The finer elements penetrate the coarser elements, and no space is left empty of body. So this is all just elaborating more material from the Timaeus, and we'll see where Alcinous goes next. So now we come to the soul of the world, the stars and the planets. The soul should be counted a first principle of all things, since it is what we use to discern all things, and as like is known by like, so the soul's essence reflects the distinctions it recognizes in things. This is an argument I have not seen before, to my recollection, for the kind of primacy of soul. We recognize all the distinctions in the world, and therefore the pattern of all of these distinctions is already there in the soul. There are indivisible, intelligible essences and divisible ones. The soul is made from both, so it has its indivisible aspect and the aspect that is divisible about bodies. The world is generated, but eternally. There is not a particular start date on creation. And God doesn't create the soul of the world, which is eternal, but he brings it to order by calling it towards himself and the forms contained therein. So God doesn't create the soul of the world, according to Alcinous, although I think that an emanationist model in the fashion of late Neoplatonism would say that there is a manner in which the soul is created outside of time, not simply that it's brought into order, but that its existence does emanate from a prior source. Alcinous emphasizes the eternality and uncreated nature of the world soul. The world is a living thing and has intellect. The soul of the world holds the body of the world together, and its exterior parts have dominance over the interior ones. The outer circuit, the fixed stars, remains undivided. The inner was split into 7 circles, so the outer is like the form of the same, and the inner is like the form of the other. The same is superior to the other in general. The outer circle moves to the right, and the inner circle moves to the left. the right is better than the left, according to the Pythagoreans. This, however, does not hold within the inner circuit. It's not the case that whatever is further out among the planets is a superior planet. The sun is situated in the middle of those inner spheres, and yet is still superior to the other planets. The planets measure time, and time measures eternity. The planets align once in a great while to produce the perfect number and time. The planets are living beings endowed with intelligence and also are gods. We next look at what Alcinous calls the created gods, or the daimons. They are present in each of the 5 elements, including ether. Some are visible, others invisible, which seems to imply then that the elements themselves, in their visible form, contain daimonical spirits or souls. They permeate all of the terrestrial world so that no part of the world is without a share in soul or in immortal life. Daimons administer the sublunar sphere, the realm of change in Aristotle's conception. They do the will of the primal god. So daimons are, according to Alcinous, administering the commands of the primal god, but the primal god does kind of remain exempt and just kind of makes sure that everything is maintained, but these intermediaries do the work. No mention is made of possible declined daimons or evil daimons. Daimons are responsible for omens, presages, dreams, oracles, and all human methods of divination. And then we also get in this section that the earth is in the middle of the universe. It is the eldest of the gods within the heaven after the soul of the world, which is interesting. The ether is outermost with 2 layers, the fixed stars and the planets. Between ether and earth is air. So according to Alcinous, the ether is out there in space, in the heavens. It's the medium in which the planets and fixed stars move. And daimonical spirits are in the ether, just like they're in fire and water and earth and everything in the sublunar realm. And after the order of the world is established, we now deal with the creation of man and other living beings. So mortal creatures were created by the lower gods because they would be necessarily immortal if created directly by God. Mortal creatures were created by borrowing from primal matter for fixed periods of time. Whether matter has an archetype, whether there is a prime matter, is up for debate in Neoplatonism. Alcinous says there is such a thing as primal matter. Iamblichus identifies primal matter with the indefinite dyad, which is the ultimate patient. The infinite is receptive of division and structure, whereas the limit, Paros, imposes structure and order. So in the highest realm, the archetype of matter is that ultimate patient, the indefinite dyad. And this matter is borrowed for fixed periods of time for the various mortal creatures. Humanity was created most akin to the gods, and the number of human souls is equal to the number of the stars. And as each human soul sat on its kindred star, the demiurge taught them the laws of fate. He warned against attachment to the body, which moves from sensation to pleasure and pain, and then to fear and anger. Souls that dominated these affections would return to their kindred star, have release from the cycle. Others would be reincarnated as women, and if they continued to be led by passions, they would be incarnated as wild animals. Now we'll look in more detail at the construction of the human body. The body was molded primarily out of earth, fire, air, and water, and we'll see what other components go into it, and fit together with invisible pegs to make the body one and single. The gods placed the ruling part of the soul in the head, with the brain as a sort of field for the ruling part of the soul, which is an interesting description. That's worth remembering, I think. Alcinous thinks that the brain is a sort of field for the ruling part of the soul. Bone marrow was made from smooth and unwarped triangles. So not any of the elements, but the elements of the elements, the triangles that we saw from the Timaeus. So the same triangles that were used to make the elements. The bone marrow triangles are the source of semen, which kind of makes sense. If semen is this seed of new human beings, then it needs to contain what it needs to build up all of the constituents of the body. Bone is made from earth and marrow, moistened and tempered in water and fire. Sinews are made from bone and flesh is made from a sort of fermentation of salty and acidic elements. Marrow is enclosed in bone, bone enclosed by sinews, which allow the bones to move and connect, which is enclosed by flesh. The organs were woven from the same tissues as the aforementioned. Food is digested by being cut up and softened by breath and heat, and then distributed through the body. Now, two veins run up the spine and cross each other. They meet at the head and bind it down, and from there divide into many branches. So we have a caduceus imagery here. The soul was bound into the body, which is an interesting way of phrasing that. Not all Platonists agree that the soul is in the body. Alcinous says it was bound into the body. The starting points of the marrow and nerves are in the head, and the sense organs are mostly on the head to guard the ruling element of the soul. The sense of sight, Alcinous says, operates because the gods enclosed the luminous aspect of fire in the eyes. So not necessarily fire itself, but the luminous aspect of fire was enclosed in the eyes. This luminosity flows out through the whole eyes, but especially through the pupils. This effluence gets blended with external light because it is of a similar nature, like knows like, and this produces the sensation of sight, qua sensation, which is kind of the lowest level of our cognitive faculties in the divided line. So it's significant that it's only when there is this blending with the external light that the sensation of sight results. When there is no light outside, the stream doesn't coalesce with anything and so remains inside, where it, quote unquote, smooths out and dissolves our internal movements. And that induces sleep, and that's why the eyelids close, to keep your eye fire inside. If some motions persist, so your internal motions are not completely smoothed out and dissolved, then many images appear to us, which presumably are dreams, but then dreams are also caused by daimons, so perhaps the daimons cause particular internal movements of this luminous aspect of fire. The other senses, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, are treated next. Hearing begins with a movement in the head and terminates in the liver. Smell comes from the veins in the nostrils and moves as far as to the navel. Types of odor are not specified beyond pleasant and unpleasant. Of course, that's not the case for us, but Alcinous doesn't know any species of odor beyond good and bad odors. All odors are thicker than air and thinner than water. It is a half-breed class because it is present in the transition from air to water or vice versa. Taste moves from the tongue to the heart. There are 7 types of flavor, distinguished by the contractions and dilations caused by the presence of the flavor, although that's not quite keeping with the specific descriptions of the flavors he gives. The 7 flavors are sweet, acidic, astringent, dry, salty, pungent, and bitter. And he doesn't describe pungent. Sweetness is opposite to all the others. Doesn't really elaborate that. Acids stir up and tear the tongue. Astringents heat the tongue and have a rising motion. They roughly contract the pores of the tongue, whereas dry things contract the pores of the tongue less roughly. Bitter things have a dissolving effect on the tongue. Salty things gently clean and purge the tongue. Touch perceives temperature, hardness, weight, and texture. Things with small bases, I assume small components that make them up, are yielding and soft. Things with larger bases are solid and stable. Unevenness plus hardness equals roughness. Evenness plus compactness equals smoothness. Heat and cold are produced by opposite causes. Heat is caused by sharp and rapid movement of particles, and he does use that word particles. Cold is produced by thicker particles expelling the smaller particles. So there is sort of some truth to that. Now we look at heaviness and lightness. These things, he says, should not be described in terms of what is naturally above or below. He says because the world is spherical. I don't know why above couldn't simply be defined as away from center and below defined as center. He goes on to say that the heavy is that which is with difficulty drawn into any place other than its natural one. But he doesn't say what the natural place of heavy things is. The heavy is also compounded of more parts than the light. The light is what is easily drawn out of its natural place. It's compounded of less parts. Other ancients have said that certain elements are heavier and have their place naturally lower or below, and other elements are lighter and have their natural place above. That's the more typical view. Alcinous is pushing back on this, but then he doesn't really have an alternative explanation for the natural place of the elements in different sorts of bodies. He then moves to the diseases of man and their causes. So one cause is the deficiency in excess of various elements, or their being misplaced in the body. Another is the inverse production of homogeneous parts, e.g. flesh into blood or phlegm. It's a kind of decomposition. Phlegm is a product of decomposition. So insofar as phlegm is a normal humor, it's not always the cause of disease. Phlegm is not always a cause of disease. And sweat and tears are a byproduct of phlegm. When phlegm moves to the surface of the body, it makes pimples and spots. When it stays in the body, it mixes sometimes with black bile and causes the sacred disease. Acidic and saline phlegm is the cause of all diseases involving flux or catarrh, which is a stuffy nose. Inflammation is caused by bile. Bile and phlegm cause many diseases. Constant fevers are caused by an excess of fire. Daily fevers, he uses the term quotidian there, or I guess the translator does, are caused by an excess of air. Tertian, from an excess of water. I don't know exactly what this is supposed to mean. Quartan, from an excess of earth. If anybody can guess what he means by tertian fevers or quartan fevers, go ahead and let me know in the comments. The next section is on the soul in relation to the body. The lower gods receive the immortal aspect of human souls from the primal god and then add to it two mortal parts. So the lower gods don't create the human soul entire. That which is immortal in it comes from the primal god. Recall that what is made by the primal god is immortal of necessity, so this does fit with what Alcinous said earlier. The head is separated from the rest of the body and is shaped like a sphere because it hosts the immortal part of the soul. So it's separated by the neck so that the immortal part is not contaminated as much by the mortal parts. Of course, irrational animals also have necks, so I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. The spirited and mortal part of the soul they established in the heart, and the appetitive part was placed around the navel. And then he kind of leaves the soul and talks about organs again. The lungs were made for the sake of the heart as padding. The liver stirs up and calms down the soul and has both sweetness and bitterness. The liver also conveys divinations through dreams. Because it is smooth, solid, and bright, it receives powers from the intellect. So because like is known by like, and the liver is a shiny organ, it's able to receive the light of the intellect, and that's why it's the organ of divination. The spleen is for the sake of the liver, to purify it and keep it bright. it receives the impurities that accumulate around the liver. We next look at a variety of points on the immortality of the soul. The soul brings life to whatever it is attached to. What brings life intrinsically is not receptive of death and is immortal. Therefore, the soul is immortal. Because it is essential to soul to impart life to body whenever it resides in body, life is an intrinsic part of the soul and is not receptive of its opposite. This idea of an essential property not being alienated from itself and never admitting its contrary, and then an accidental property actually coming from its contrary, is interesting. It is in Plato for sure, and he'll use this idea of an accidental property below. But the soul is an intelligible, incorporeal essence, unchanging in its substance, indivisible and uniform. It is incomposite, indissoluble, and indispersible, and then body is the opposite. So it is composite, dissoluble, dispersible. Here's another argument. The soul is thrown into confusion by contact with the body. That which is thrown into confusion by contact with something is not akin to that thing. So the soul is not akin to body, but to the intelligible. Additionally, inasmuch as it has a ruling nature, it is akin to the divine. Now, things that are contraries of one another by virtue of their accidental properties naturally come to be from one another. This does occur in Plato. So essential properties never admit of their contraries. Accidental properties actually are generated from their contraries. Life is the union of soul with body. Death is their separation. There's also the argument from anamnesis, which Plato gives as well. Learning must be through remembering, because if we could only induce from particulars, we couldn't form stable concepts. If we remember things we knew before birth, then the soul had pre-existence. So you prove anamnesis, and a logical consequence of that doctrine is the immortality of the soul. The soul isn't destroyed by its own proper vice, which Alcinous doesn't specify, but he was just before this talking about forgetfulness, so maybe that is the proper vice of the soul. So nothing else less vicious can destroy it. If the one thing that is most harmful to the soul, most intrinsically its vice, does not destroy it, then nothing else, which by definition is less vicious, can destroy it either. That which is primarily self-moving is eternally moving, and therefore immortal. The self-moving is the first principle of all motion, and first principles are ungenerated and indestructible. So because that which is primarily self-moving moves eternally, and the soul is primarily self-moving, it is immortal. And because that which is self-moving is a first principle of motion in general, and first principles are not destroyed, then the soul cannot be destroyed because it is that intrinsic self-mover. So I will say that these formulations are not as good as what appears in Plato, and not as good as what I've seen from some other Neoplatonists. But in any case, it is a catalog of common arguments. Rational souls are held to be immortal, but there is dispute about irrational souls. Now, because souls are immortal, they progress through many bodies, human and non-human. There is a natural affinity for one another between soul and body, like there is between fire and asphalt. That's the analogy we get. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that. Fire obviously has the ability to heat and mold asphalt, impart form to it in a certain way, also to dissolve form, though. So the souls of the gods have a critical element, an appetitive element, and an appropriative element. This is the first I've seen of this. So even the gods have a kind of tripartite soul. But when humans are embodied, these latter two aspects of soul are altered, the appropriative into the libidinous and the appetitive into the spirited. So there's some confusion of translation here because appetitive is usually used to indicate the lowest part of the soul, not the middle part. In any case, though, here is an interesting doctrine. I'm not sure where else it appears. The gods have a kind of tripartite soul, and humans who are in the train of the gods and decline from the gods in a certain way have that same tripartite structure, but the bottom two elements that appear in the gods get warped from the appetitive to the spirited and from the appropriative to the libidinous. These terms don't help too much in understanding what is the nature of this corruption, but I think that's an interesting fact worth knowing. And if anybody knows any other places in the ancient Platonists where this idea appears, just let me know in the comments. On the topic of man and fate, Alcinous says, all things are within the sphere of fate, but not all things are fated. Fate is like a law, and particular events are not fated. There are, he says, infinite particular events and infinite people that come into being. If all things were fated, nothing would be in our power, and there would be no real praise and blame. So fate is like a karmic law. If a soul chooses a given type of life and performs a given set of actions, a necessary set of consequences will follow. This is Alcinous's definition of fate. Actions are not compelled, consequences are. The possible is between the true and the false, and that's the sphere of our free will. And he differentiates that from the potential. Potential indicates a definite aptitude. The possible remains indefinite and becomes true or false as a consequence of free will. Now we're turning to ethics to look at the highest good and its relationship to happiness. He says that Plato says, the greatest good is not easy to discover, and if discovered, it is not safely revealed to all. He doesn't elaborate this, unfortunately. He does say, certainly he, Plato, only imparted his views on the good to a very small, select group of his associates. But he placed clues throughout the dialogues that give us enough hints to reconstruct his doctrines. So Plato placed the highest good in knowledge and contemplation of the primal good, which is God and the primal intellect. So here, we don't have the separation between the primal intellect and then the one and the good, which is often a feature of Neoplatonic systems. They would argue that can be read into Plato himself. Alcinous sides with Aristotle here and attributes that view to Plato, which is that the primal good, God, and the primal intellect are one. All goods acquire their title from participation of the primal good. So anything that is truly good is good insofar as it participates of that primal good. The only part of us that can be like the primal good is intellect and reason, and they can be good in themselves. All other mortal goods, health, beauty, strength, wealth, etc., are only good if they are used for the sake of virtue. Only philosophical souls can experience the greatest goods, and only the noble is good. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. He also distinguishes three kinds of good, one being false. So there is the good of contact with the primal good, which only the rational soul can enjoy. There are goods that are good because they bring us closer to that participate of that. And then there are the things that are commonly called good, which are not true goods. The ultimate end for man in Platonism, according to Alcinous, is likeness to God. Plato says that likeness to God comes through being intelligent, just, and pious in the Theaetetus. In the Republic, he says it consists in being just and practicing virtue. In the Phaedo, he says likeness to God is being self-controlled and just. Sometimes Plato says that the ultimate end for man is being like God. Other times he says it is following God, sometimes both, which is not too surprising because in order to become like God, presumably you would have to first follow God, although the ultimate end would be that likeness. The God we are to be like is the God in the heavens, not, of course, the God above the heavens. So exactly what level this comes to is not clear. Are we talking about a demiurge-like figure or what? Alcinous doesn't specify for us. but it's the God in the heavens, not the hypercosmic gods. This might be a result of Stoic influence. Perhaps the idea of virtue in Stoicism was tied to reflecting natural law. And if Alcinous conceives of that natural law as being embodied in the God in the heavens, then this idea of becoming like the God in the heavens would be very similar to the Stoic concept of virtue. Good fortune is the good state of one's guardian spirit. Ill fortune is the ill state of one's guardian spirit. That seems a little out of place, but he throws that in there. In order to attain likeness to God, we need a suitable nature, to develop proper habits and a way of life, good practice according to law, to use reason and education and the correct philosophical tradition to distance ourselves from most human concerns and come in contact with intelligible reality. And the introductory ceremonies of initiation into the greater sciences will be music, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and gymnastics. Now, virtue is defined as the most excellent state of the soul, which makes a man graceful, harmonious, and firm in speech and action with respect to himself and others. Graceful, harmonious, and firm. Two kinds of virtue, rational and irrational. And of the irrational, there are two types, courage and self-control. So the rational virtue is wisdom, the virtue of the reasonable part of the soul. Courage is the virtue of the spirited emotions, thumos. And self-control is the virtue of epithumia or appetite. Temperance or self-control is also something that extends to all of the aspects of the soul, but its peculiar place is appetite. Wisdom is the science of good and evil. Self-control is the order of desires and impulses, submission to reason. And courage is maintenance of a law-abiding opinion as to what is and what is not to be feared. He also says it's the capacity to maintain a law-abiding doctrine. So law here is equated with right reason. Plato calls courage a wisdom of what is and what is not to be feared. Justice is a harmonization of wisdom, courage, and temperance, each part doing its proper business, and there is a mutual implication of the virtues, where they are inseparable from each other. Courage is also maintaining right reason, so it relies on wisdom, but wisdom in turn relies on courage to avoid the obscuring influence of cowardice. You can't tell what is good and what's evil if you're clouded by cowardice, and then wisdom also relies on temperance. There are other ways in which they interpenetrate, but that's what Alcinous gives us. The next section is on good natural dispositions and progress towards virtue. Alcinous' concept of virtue is elaborated here. Another sense of the term virtue is good natural dispositions and progress toward actual virtue. The previous definition of virtue itself was the perfected state of the soul, the most excellent state of the soul, which makes a man graceful, harmonious, and firm. That's actualized virtue, but things that get us towards that actual state, we also call virtues, or good natural dispositions that can be cultivated into actualized virtue. Actualized, perfect virtues don't admit of degrees, but imperfect virtues and vices do. So true wisdom is one, but because we call people wise when they have imperfect wisdom, we can say that one man is more wise than another. Some vices are incompatible with each other. For example, recklessness and cowardice, or libertinism and miserliness. All the vices cannot reside in the same man, which makes sense. The good things are able to be brought into a unity. The bad things can't. That's very consistent with Platonic themes. There is an intermediate neutral position between virtue and vice. So there is a spectrum there. Some virtues are predominant, some subsidiary. The virtues of reason perfect the other virtues. So the virtues of reason, wisdom, are superior and order the inferior virtues. The other virtues don't have reason inherent in them, but rely on wisdom, which they grow in contact with through habituation and practice. So although courage, for example, is a kind of wisdom, it depends on wisdom itself for its discernment. And it, as a habit of the soul, becomes informed by wisdom by constant contact with that authentic wisdom itself. The lower virtues are not technically teachable because they don't have reason inherent in them, although their proper objects can be taught through wisdom, and wisdom is teachable. The lower virtues have to be basically habituated. Courage and temperance develop through contact with wisdom, but because that wisdom isn't inherent in them, you don't, strictly speaking, teach the lower virtues. They have to be practiced. Virtues are in one sense an extreme of perfection, and in another a mean between two vices, which is the Aristotelian idea, the golden mean. So they are mean between excess and deficiency. For example, you have meanness, and then generosity, which is the virtue, and then prodigality, which is another vice. Passions can be unmeasured, either through overstepping or falling short of what's appropriate. So someone who failed to become angry at an insult to his parents, or who failed to grieve at the death of his parents, would not be moderate. And that does depart from Stoic ideas. Epictetus goes as far as to say that you should be prepared to lose a child without being attached to it. Alcinous is saying that moderate passions are felt in their appropriate degrees. So you don't lose yourself in grief, but you also don't remain completely stone cold when you experience loss. There is a season for all of these passions in their due measure. So most of the virtues are means between excess and deficiency, although he does qualify that a little bit and says at least most of them instead of all of them. Perhaps he means wisdom is the exception, because it's hard to imagine an excess of reason or wisdom. The next section is on the involuntariness of vice. So virtue is a result of voluntary effort. Vice is involuntary. We have here basically arguments similar to those found in the Gorgias. Since people who engage in vice always think that what they do is good for them on some level, they can make this mistake from ignorance or from the obscuring influence of a passion. Everyone always does what they do in pursuit of some good. They can be mistaken from ignorance or because their vision is clouded by some passion. Vice is involuntary, and although vice is involuntary, it should still be punished, since that heals vicious souls. We then move on to the emotions. A definition is given. An emotion is an irrational motion of the soul in response to something good or bad. Emotions are not judgments or opinions. They take place in the affective part of the soul and aren't technically our own actions either, and they are not completely under our control. Actually, as emotions per se, they are involuntary, and the way we respond to emotions and condition and habituate our emotive faculties is under our control, not the emotions themselves. We can judge some sensations to be neutral, but our emotions can nevertheless be attracted or averse to them. So emotion is not judgment, because we can have these two different evaluations. One judgment that a thing is neutral, one emotion of attraction or something else. There are only two basic emotions, pleasure and distress. The others are compounds of those two. So desire involves both the pleasure of hope and the anxiety of separation from the object of desire. So it is compounded of pleasure and distress. Some emotions are wild, some are tame. Tame emotions are necessary and proper for humans. They are good as long as they're moderate. This is similar to the idea of certain passions being moderate when they are exercised in their appropriate context to the appropriate degree, whereas wild emotions are always bad, never appropriate for human beings, such as mockery, schadenfreude, and misanthropy. Distress arises from motions in our soul contrary to nature. Pleasure arises from tendencies to restore the natural state. The natural state is between distress and pleasure. And because pleasure can be mixed with its opposite, it is not a true being in the sense of a form, and so it's not purely good. No pleasure is ever absolutely and purely good. We now move on to friendship and love. Friendship arises from reciprocal goodwill. There is a desire for equal good things between friends, and this equality can only subsist between like characters which are ruled by measure. So that's the criteria of two people becoming friends. They have to want what is best for each other, and they have to be measured characters. If they are unmeasured themselves, they can't be brought into equality. Many things called friendship, including familial and political bonds, are not always properly friendships because they may not involve reciprocity of goodwill and that equality. There are three forms of erotic love: the honorable, the neutral, and the dishonorable. The base love aims only at the body and is dominated by pleasure. The noble one is directed only at the soul and promotes virtue. The middle one is attracted towards both body and soul, but leans towards soul. A person who is a suitable object of love is neutral, neither good nor bad. Love is a daimon, not a god. The noble love can be considered an art and belongs to the rational soul. The aim of that art is to discern the worthy object of love, to gain possession of it, and to make use of it by instilling virtue in it. The noble lover and beloved should aim to become friends rather than lovers. Next, we look at politics, the various types of state and constitution. The best and non-hypothetical constitution mirrors the divisions of the soul, with guardians corresponding to the rational part of the soul, auxiliaries to the spirited emotion, and artisans to appetite. Guardians are meant to deliberate and administer justice. Auxiliaries take military and police actions directed by the guardians. Artisans exercise arts and crafts. And rulers should be philosophers who contemplate the primary good. The five basic types of constitution are aristocratic, ruled by the best; timocratic, ruled by spirited emotion, honor is the highest value, warrior society; democratic, which is kind of an equality of all different sorts of virtue together; the oligarchic, which is kind of ruled by the appetitive portion and wealth, of course; and then the tyrannical, which is ruled by one overarching desire, which is usually love, but erotic love, and a base erotic love. Plato describes other constitutions that are only appropriate for certain conditions defined by geography and population. So a city by the shore should have naval forces and a merchant fleet and things like that. Politics is a theoretical and practical virtue that aims to render a state good, happy, harmonious, and concordant. The next section is the difference between philosopher and the sophist. The sophist makes himself available for hire and prefers seeming to being noble. The philosopher does not make himself available for hire by the young and prefers being noble to seeming. The sophist concerns himself with non-being, which is not really defined that well, but then the next section here is on non-being. So non-being is not the opposite of being, but expresses a secondary relation to another thing which follows upon being in the primary sense. And if things didn't participate in non-being, they couldn't be distinguished from each other. This section is a little confused in the original text. The varieties of non-being are as extensive as the varieties of being. So non-being is a kind of principle of individuation between particular beings. In order to be one particular thing, you have to not be others. And the sophist is concerned with all these distinctions of particulars. And I would imagine that's because the sophist looks towards the world of generation rather than the world of the forms, of course. And then there's a brief conclusion. Alcinous says something nice and candid when he says, some of what has been said has been presented in the proper order, other parts perhaps somewhat randomly and out of order. But he is happy with this guide into studying Platonism. As I said, some people think this was intended for teachers of Platonism. Others think that this was a kind of introductory text for students. But it's historically interesting anyway. It gives us a peek into Middle Platonist thought, and we will follow up in the vein of Middle Platonism. The next video on this channel should be on Plutarch. So that's it. Thank you guys for listening. We are done with Alcinous. If anyone knows any extra historical details or wants to correct anything that I have gotten wrong in this summary, please do so in the comments. Again, thank you guys for listening, and God bless.